Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Janine Matts. I am an English language specialist with RELO. I am also a professor of linguistics at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador in Quito. Today, we are going to be starting a series of webinars related to second language acquisition theory and its practical applications in the classroom. So to start with today's topic, we're going to look at the effect of the affective filter, motivation and confidence in the English classroom. So let's get started. So some of you might be thinking the affective filter, that's old news, right? It was actually first suggested by Dulay and Burt in 1977. But then it was made more popular in Krashen's input hypothesis. Krashen said, and we have a quote right here, "The amount of comprehensible input the acquirer receives and understands, and the degree to which the acquirer is open to the input." We're going to talk a lot about comprehensible input in later sessions. Today, our focus is going to be on how open the acquirer is to the input. But before we continue, we have to be sure that we understand what comprehensible input is. So here we have a definition. Comprehensible input can be defined as language that can be understood by our students, even though they may not know every word or grammatical structure. So in this case, it's language that's basically simplified to the level of our students so that they are able to process the messages in that language. This person right here on the screen, if you are not familiar with him, his name is Dr. Stephen Krashen. He's a North American linguist. He's in his 80s now, and he continues to be very active in the field of language acquisition, giving webinars, doing research. He's probably one of the most important figures that you need to know in the field of language acquisition theory. And he says, "The best methods are therefore those that supply comprehensible input in low anxiety situations, containing messages that students really want to hear. These methods do not force early production in the second language, but allow students to produce when they are ready, recognizing that improvement comes from supplying communicative and comprehensible input, not from forcing and correcting production." I invite you to remember back to your days as a student, right? All of us teachers were students at one point. You may be students of English as a foreign language. I was a student of Spanish as a foreign language. And I remember when my teachers would ask us to produce sentences in Spanish, right? They would teach us a new verb form or something, and they would say, "Okay, go, say something." And I remember feeling this anxiety, this stress, saying, "I'm not ready. I don't know how to communicate in Spanish yet," right? So a lot of teachers, we make the mistake of making students produce too early before they have the linguistic tools to be able to do that. And this is a cause of great anxiety for our students, right? Dr. Krashen even speaks of something called the silent period, where students should be allowed to receive the target language, but not be forced to produce it yet, right? And this is something that's very important to take into consideration. Okay, so then, when talking about the affective filter, right? If we have a low affective filter, we have more successful acquisition. And if we have a high affective filter, we have less successful acquisition, okay? In that case, normally we would think that something that's high is better, right? We want our students to have high motivation, high grades, and all that. But in the case of the affective filter, lower is better, right? That means that if our students have a lower affective filter, we will have more successful acquisition. Why is this the case? Because we can think of the affective filter as a type of wall, right? So if we have this wall up in our brains, right, this is like a psychological construct. If we have a high wall here, even if we as teachers give our students comprehensible input, good quality input, what happens with that input? the input will hit this wall in the student's brain and it will not be able to be absorbed by the students, right? And so we have a problem because they won't be able to take in the English that we're giving them, and much less be able to produce English, right? So it's very important that we as teachers work with this affective filter as well and try to reduce the wall, right? Lower the wall so that the comprehensible input that we give students will enter their brains easier, right? So lower in this case is definitely better. Okay, what makes up the affective filter? What components make up the affective filter? Well, we have some here on the screen. Motivation is the big one. Yeah, if our students are motivated to learn English, to explore English, they will have lower affective filters, right? Okay, we'll talk about motivation a little bit later and some ways to motivate our students. Anxiety, that is another factor that makes up the affective filter. If our students feel very anxious in our class, that builds the affective filter and makes it higher. Yeah, stress. If they're stressed out by our evaluations, if they're stressed by the class itself, if they're stressed by the environment in the classroom, or if they're stressed from everyday life, they can bring this to our classroom, and that also raises the affective filter, right? And positive and negative previous experiences with the target language and or culture. So when your students arrive to your classroom, they've already had experiences in most cases with English. What have those experiences been like? Have they been positive? Have they been negative? All of that will influence their affective filters in your classroom. So what raises or lowers the affective filter? Remember, if it's raised, it's bad. Okay, so on the left side of the screen, you guys can see some situations that will raise the affective filter. For example, stressful situations at home or in the classroom, right? It's not always in the classroom that's the problem. Sometimes students carry stressful situations from home into our classroom, right? Nervousness brought on by the subject itself. We've all felt nervous in class at some point, right? When we have to give a presentation or we have to take a test. So we know what that feels like. If our students have a lot of nervousness, their affective filters are going to raise, right? Lack of motivation, saying, I don't need this, right? I don't need English in this case. And there are some students who believe that they don't need English in their particular circles in their life, right? So we need to take these feelings into consideration because they all construct a high affective filter, yeah? And also bad personal experiences with previous teachers of English, for example, if they had previous teachers who treated them poorly, or if in previous English classes, all they did was memorize words, right? Or all they did was do boring worksheets and they didn't like that. Or in some cases, if some students have had previous experiences with the target culture. I remember I had a student who once traveled to the United States and had a bad experience in New York because they were robbed, right? And so that affects their affective filter as well because they had a bad experience in an English-speaking context, right? So all of these components can affect our affective filter and raise it, which is what we don't want, right? So then what can lower the affective filter? What can we do in that case? Providing a relaxed environment to learn, a comfortable classroom, a classroom where students feel safe, right? This is very important. Motivation brought on by the teacher or the usefulness of the class itself. If students see how useful English can be in their context, they will be more motivated to learn it. Positive personal experiences with the language, with the culture, with previous English classes, these all contribute to lowering the affective filter. And confidence boosters, right? Confidence boosters, we refer to these nice comments that we make to students or that students will make to each other in class that makes them feel more sure about their English and more confident in that they can communicate using the language. All of these components on the right side lower the affective filter for our students, and this is what we want, right? We have to remind ourselves that we as teachers have a lot of power in our hands to make or break our students' experience with and consequently acquisition of English. right? And this is the same for all subjects. I'm sure you guys can remember back to your high school days when you took different subjects, right? For example, physics. I remember physics in high school. Physics was not fun for me. But one year I had a teacher of physics who was such an incredible teacher that he made me dislike physics a little bit less. I was a little bit okay with physics because he really put magic in the classroom. He made us feel comfortable. He made us feel capable of learning physics. He really reached us as students, right? So that's a positive experience with the teacher. The opposite can also happen, right? We can have classes that, okay, we like the class itself, the subject, but then we get a teacher who does not make us feel comfortable and welcome and relaxed in the classroom environment. And the opposite can happen. We can start disliking the subject, right? So we have a lot of power over the way that our students react to the subject that we're teaching. I'm sure some of you right now in the Facebook audience have experienced this, where you've had a student come to you at the end of the school year and say, teacher, at the beginning of the school year, I didn't like English, but now I'm so happy. I love it, or I like it better now, or I feel more comfortable speaking English now. Thank you, teacher, right? And that's a very rewarding feeling for us. So if we can help to lower those affective filters in our students, we should do it. How do we do that? How do we help lower the affective filters? So I came up with 3, let's say, steps that we can use to help lower the affective filter. Analyze, empathize, exercise, right? What do we mean by analyze? Analyze means determine the level of the affective filter and find the causes of high ones through observation or questions. I will give you a technique in a moment on how we can do this, right? Empathize. Put yourselves in your students' shoes. Understand that there is life beyond your classroom. We're all human, right? And we all have to deal with circumstances that have nothing to do with the English classroom. So sometimes these circumstances overflow into the English classroom, and we have to be sure that we are conscious of these situations, especially in the time of the pandemic that we lived through and post-pandemic, because it has left marks on our students as well, right? And third, exercise. Develop a plan of action based on your students' situations and put it into practice. So we'll take a look at some suggestions of things that we can do to help lower the affective filter in our students. Okay, how do we diagnose the student's affective filter? This question that we have on the screen here is one that I like to use when I have to teach English classes at the university. At the beginning of the semester, the first day, when we do an introduction, getting to know you and everything, I give them this question. And I say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being a root canal and 10 being fresh baked chocolate chip cookies, how do you feel about English and why? Why do I phrase the question this way? Because I think if we can quantify their affective filters, we get a better overall picture of how our class is towards English, right? So I've had everything from negative numbers. They go off the scale. They put negative numbers, or some students put 50, 100, 1,000, all these things, okay? So the point here is that if we can quantify it, we can get a better overall picture of how they feel, right? And why do I include these components of a root canal and fresh baked chocolate chip cookies? Because this is a cultural component. Where I'm from Chicago originally. Where I'm from, we use a phrase to say it's worse than a root canal, for us to compare something to something that is terrible, right? Because a root canal is terrible. If you've ever had one, it's a procedure in your molar teeth, right? If you've ever had one, you know what I'm talking about. They're very bad. So I use that, and then fresh baked chocolate chip cookies, because this is also a cultural staple for us, right? And it's something that pretty much everyone loves. So that's why I give them these ideas as the scale, right? And then they answer me, and I tell my students, the correct answer here is the honest answer, right? So if you're honest with your answer to me, then it's correct, okay? So let's see, if you put 1, that's okay, that's totally fine. I want to know why you put 1. I want to know what that means, yeah? I want to know what contributed to that. And I get responses from everything from terrible teachers, terrible books, I don't understand English, the time that someone got robbed in New York. I mean, I've received responses of all different types. And that's important for us to know, because then we can figure out how to deal with these lower numbers, with the high affective filters, right? We can figure out how to lower them based on the reasons that they give us, okay? This is a phrase that Ronald Reagan used way back in the time of the Berlin Wall, right? Where he said, tear down that wall. Yeah, and so we want to tear down that wall, like the figurative wall. First, in order to do this, we have to see our students as the humans that they are. And I really like this quote by John Maxwell, where he says, students don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And this is so true. I'm sure you can comment on this as well, teachers who've had experience with this. This is true starting with little kids, 5 years old, all the way through university students and adults. It doesn't matter the age. This is universal. We as humans don't care if the teacher is an expert in the field if we see that the teacher doesn't care about us as students, right? A little bit of empathy goes a long way to try to get yourself to know your students as humans, things like that, first, before we try to teach them any English. Yeah? Okay, so let's imagine that we've determined that our students have high affective filters. What can we do? What can we do with those high affective filters? As teachers, we feel responsible for our students' learning a lot of the time, right? Even though we're not entirely responsible, students are also responsible for their learning. But this is normal for a teacher to say, what can I do to make them learn or to help them to learn the language better or whatever, okay? So let's look at some techniques. Here we have a 2-minute activity that we can use at the beginning of class. Okay, this is easily done in person or online. I realize that some of you in different contexts around the world might be teaching online, so we can also do this activity online. If you are online and you connect synchronously, students can put one word or emoji in the chat about how they're doing at the beginning of each class. You can even establish this as a habit if you want every day in your class, right? If we're working in person, yes, we can ask them, how are you feeling today? But not the typical rhetorical question like, okay, students, hi, how are you today? Today we're going to talk about the present continuous. No. Like an actual question to really get a response on how they're doing. We can ask them to use adjectives. They can say they're happy, tired, sad, frustrated, etc. Right? Okay. But we can also do this in a more creative way. I can ask my students, what color do you feel like today? What color describes you today, right? And they can say their colors, right? Red. Why are you red today? Because I'm angry. Or yellow. Why are you yellow today? Because I'm happy, So it gets them to think a little bit more critically about their own feelings, right? We can do this as animals. We can say, for example, okay, what animal do you feel like today? I feel like a cat because I'm very docile and soft or whatever. I feel like a bull because I'm very angry, whatever. Obviously, if the students know the vocabulary for animals, we can do this, right? So we can do this in different ways. We can also do this using these types of images. And if you look on the internet, you will find an image like this for practically everything. Britney Spears, Justin Bieber, everything, right? Here I just put a couple as examples. Baby Yoda, you guys can tell us how you're feeling today on a Baby Yoda scale. Go ahead and share in the chat if you'd like to tell us how you're feeling today. Yeah, on a Baby Yoda scale. My students in linguistics, my university students, they grew up with SpongeBob. So I can use the pick your Patrick mood because SpongeBob is part of their childhood, right? Or we have here Ross, again, from the series Friends that continues to be popular 30 years later. On a scale of Ross, how are you doing today? You'll see on the internet there are so many. I've seen sheep, right? I've seen rubber ducks. I've seen everything you can imagine. So depending on what your students are interested in, you can choose one of these images for them to describe how they're feeling. And not only will you connect with them on a cultural level because they like what you're showing them, they can identify with the characters or the images, but on top of that, they're going to see that you care about how they're doing, that you're interested in how they're doing. Yeah. And that's going to set the tone for a more successful class, because they're going to realize my teacher cares about me. And as corny as that sounds, and as silly as that might sound, it's true. It's true. Okay. Yeah. How else? Motivating them. Okay, motivation is very difficult sometimes, because I know even we as teachers lack motivation on some days, right? It's difficult to motivate students, and depending on their age, it might be even more difficult. Usually the teachers that I interact with tell me that the younger kids are pretty much always full of energy and motivated to learn English, to sing, to dance, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds. They start getting like 12, 13, 14, and it might become a little more difficult to motivate them. But the fundamental part of motivation is knowing what motivates them. In other words, knowing your students and knowing what they like, right? Knowing their interests. So for example, if I have here in the Ecuadorian school system, we have high school, right? That is 3 years. If I'm working with high school students, I know that high school students in Ecuador like influencers, YouTubers, and reggaeton. That's the reality, right? That's the reality of them. So that's okay. Let's work with that. Instead of fighting them and saying, oh, no, you can't like reggaeton or you have to like something else. No. They like that? Great. Let's somehow work that into the English classroom so that they're already motivated because they like the topic, right? What else can we do? As you see on the screen, we can use some games. Take a moment, those of you who are following us on Facebook, take a moment and share some games that you have used in your classroom that you consider that have been successful with your students. We can use games where students compete against each other individually, or we can use games where they work as teams, right? So I would like to be able to read some of your ideas for games that you have played in your English classroom that your students have enjoyed. Share with us, please. Go ahead in the chat. Games are entertaining and they reduce stress levels in the classroom. Okay. Music. Music is a universal language, right? I think everyone likes music. Yeah, I remember some of the songs that I was taught in my Spanish class when I was 12 years old, a long time ago. I still remember those songs. They stuck with me, right? Music has a tremendous impact on our students. So we can bring songs in. We can bring songs in that have a specific verb form we want to work on. We can bring songs in that have certain vocabulary that we want to work with, etc., right? We can use songs from Coco Melon for the little kids, all the way up to YouTube karaoke for the big kids. Yeah, we can also use this website that I mentioned here on the slide, which is lyricstraining.com. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this website already. It's kind of like a karaoke, but students get to fill in the missing words. So they can type in the word, or they can choose from a list of 3 options what word is missing in the lyrics, and the song will play along with the lyrics. It's quite entertaining, especially for the high school students. They like to do these types of things. And since they listen to Taylor Swift and these types of artists, they can choose the song and they can fill in the lyrics. It's a lot of fun to work with it and have them sing and everything. It's engaging for students. Humor. Humor is a great tool to relax students, to relax the environment, right? We can use comics, different comic strips. We can use sitcoms, depending on your students' level of understanding of English. We can use a lot of cultural staples like the Simpsons family, for example, and your own sense of humor. You can use your own sense of humor in the classroom. Here's an example. When my students are speaking too much Spanish in the English classroom, when they're constantly communicating in Spanish, I use a little bit of humor to draw their attention to that, right? Except my sense of humor, my North American humor, is very sarcastic. So I say to them, when they're speaking a lot of Spanish, I say, oh, wow, guys, your Spanish sounds amazing. This is great. You sound like native speakers. How's your English? And they like are in shock for a moment, but then they understand the irony, the humor, they laugh, and they're like, oh, sorry, Janine, we'll speak in English, okay, yeah, no problem. See, and this is a way to draw their attention to the fact that they're not speaking enough English in the classroom, but without being invasive and critical and mean about it, right? So this is a way that I've used that has worked for me. And then, of course, we have realia. right? Anything having to do with real life. Real life language they can relate to is much more fun than verb charts or filling in worksheets or anything like that. So anytime you can bring something real into the classroom, I'm sure you all have worked with Realia before. This is a much more profound experience for the students than doing things on worksheets and filling in blanks and all that stuff. Okay? Connect with them on a personal level. This is a challenge even in post-pandemic times. Find something you have in common or remember a special detail about every student. Yes, this is true. So let's imagine that you have a student named Tomas, right? And it's Friday, and Tomas is worried because Tomas has a dog named Lucas who is sick. And Lucas needs to go to the vet over the weekend, right? So Tomas tells you this in class. On Monday, when you go back to the classroom and you see Tomas, you can say, hey, Tomas, how's Lucas doing? Is he feeling better? Right? This is so simple, yet at the same time, so profound for the student because it shows the student you've thought about them, you remember a detail about them, and you're following up with them, right? Tomas now is going to sit in your class and say, I'm so glad my English teacher cares about me. Now I care about this class. Yeah, and Tomas will want to learn more. So it's very important when we can to remember certain details about our students and to bring them up when we have the opportunity. Okay, another thing to help lower the affective filters in our students is to care for their whole person. What do I mean by this? Protect their integrity by not embarrassing them in front of their classmates, right? Be careful how you correct their errors in the language. Later in the series of webinars on second language acquisition theory applied in the classroom, we're going to look at teaching the 4 skills, and we'll see how we can use techniques that are not as invasive to correct our students. But that will come in another webinar later on. Okay, for now, we can remember something called the sandwich approach. Okay, what is the sandwich approach? The sandwich approach is essentially a sandwich, right? What is a sandwich? It has 2 pieces of bread, and in the middle, we have whatever the filling is, right? It can be a ham and cheese sandwich, tuna sandwich, egg salad sandwich. It can be a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Here in Ecuador, we have sandwiches de pernil, which are very good. Yeah, it depends, right? But what is that metaphor? So the bread on both sides is a positive comment, a compliment, right? And in the middle is the constructive criticism. So if we can frame a comment towards our students with positive comments, they will receive it better. So I can say something like, for example, Mario, you know, I really liked how you were paying attention today in class. You were attentive and everything. I really appreciate that. We need to work on your pronunciation a little bit though. So it sounds more like English, okay? We're gonna work on those vowel sounds a little bit. But your ideas that you shared in class were fantastic. I really liked your critical thinking. Yeah. What happens to Mario when I give him his criticism that way is that Mario says, hey, okay, I need to work on this, but I'm doing some things right. So I'm good. This is good, right? And then Mario feels more confident and feels better about himself. So he can receive the constructive criticism in a better way because he doesn't think my teacher only thinks I'm bad at English. My teacher thinks I'm doing good things too, right? Use we as often as possible as a collective term. We. Instead of saying you and I, like separating you from the students, use the collective term we. In discourse analysis research, we've seen that, for example, politicians use this term to put them on the same level as their constituents, so that it's like we're working together. It creates solidarity. So for example, in the classroom, you can say to your students, okay, how did we do on homework this weekend? How did we do? Even if you didn't do the homework as the teacher, it's okay. Because hearing that the students are like, oh, the teacher's on my side, right? Reserve constructive criticism for private conversation, not in front of all of the classmates and other teachers or whatever. We have a one-on-one conversation. And remember that there's probably something behind that inappropriate behavior. If a student is acting inappropriately in class, acting out, calling the attention of their classmates or the teacher, there's probably a reason for that. And that's not to say we justify inappropriate behavior, no. But we have to look beyond and try to figure out what's going on so that we can help the student to correct the behavior and obviously to be able to learn more English in the process. We talked about motivation. We mentioned motivation, right? Motivation is super important in language acquisition. Without motivation, it's difficult to acquire a language. So in order to motivate our students, it's the number one reason, in fact, that people become bilingual in the world is because of need. The need for the language, right? This is the number one reason for bilingualism. So if our students can see a need for English, they're going to be more likely to be motivated to learn it, right? So what can be a possible need? Again, we need to know our students super well because not every context is the same. Yes, we have some students, for example, who are college bound. Some students will go to college. In my university in Quito, it's the case that in almost every major, students must read articles in English. So there's a motivation for college-bound students. If you want to study engineering in the university, you're going to have to read texts in English, right? So it's better if you already go into the university with a base in English. What about students in an indigenous community? This is the case in Ecuador. We have several indigenous communities. Also, I know in Peru is the case, also in Bolivia and in other countries around South America, right? We have indigenous communities. What could be the motivation there? In the case of Ecuador, we have indigenous communities that receive a lot of tourism. And what's the lingua franca in tourism? English, right? So I can tell those students, hey, you can help your community. You can promote your community, your culture by being able to speak to the tourists in English. If we have a Japanese tourist and a German tourist that come to Ecuador, they're probably going to speak English, right? That's the reality. So we can help sell products for our community. We can help communicate with the tourists, right? And get them to know our culture through English. There's a motivation. Students who love to travel, again, the lingua franca is English. We travel around the world and many places speak English. So this will also help, right? Students who are destined to study abroad, many programs are in English, even in non-English speaking countries, right? And any other cases that you can think of, yes. And absolutely, as Victor mentions in the chat, intrinsic motivation is very important from within, right? From within the students. What is their motivation? It can be a passion for the language itself, that's great, but some students don't have that passion. Maybe some of your students are gamers. Maybe they love playing video games on the internet. And what is the language that they use to communicate among the video gamers around the world? English, right? So there's another motivation to watch Friends in original version, watch movies in original version, to understand Taylor Swift when she sings. Whatever the case is, we have plenty of scenarios where we can use that, their interests, to show them their motivation for learning English, okay? Lastly, today, I would like to finish this webinar with a quote that I think is very profound. It's very interesting from a linguistic perspective, from a morphosyntactic perspective to analyze the language here, but also from the perspective of the affective filter, which we've been discussing. And that quote is the one on the top left. It says, "My students don't need me to learn. They need me to care," right? And it's true. Our students don't need us to learn English. In all reality, if they go to the internet, they can learn English themselves. They don't need us, right? But our role is fundamental with that human contact, right? Establishing that we care about our students first and foremost before we try teaching them the third conditional or anything else in English is fundamental for their later success in the acquisition of the language. Because if we can lower those affective filters, we can reduce that anxiety, we can relax our students more, we will be more successful at transmitting the language to them, and the language will become something more internal in them. And therefore, later, they will be able to communicate using the language. So this is our goal, right? Lower those affective filters, and we have a lot of power in our hands to do that. So thank you very much for joining us in this RELO webinar today. I've really enjoyed my time with you. I look forward to reading your comments in the chat. I will respond to any of your questions that you might have left there. I will be sure to look at them. I hope you can join us for next month's webinar as well. Thank you very much and have a wonderful afternoon.